So when it comes to chemistry, I had a chemistry professor that said, yeah, biology may be the study of life, but chemistry is the stuff of life. So let's talk about some of that stuff. So organisms are composed of matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. So sodium is matter, it's solid. Chlorine is matter, it's a gas. And although these two elements have completely different properties, when you combine them together, you get sodium chloride or table salt. Now, sodium is a very highly reactive metal. You notice this person is wearing gloves. And the reason why is sodium is very reactive. If you take a little piece of sodium metal and you drop it into a beaker of water, it explodes because it's so reactive. Chlorine gas is very, very toxic. It's harsh. It will burn your lungs. It will kill you. Right? So sodium explosive and chlorine toxic. You combine them together and you get sodium chloride, which is essential. We need salt. So the individual properties of an element change when they're combined to make a molecule or a compound. So elements are the fundamental forms of matter. That means they cannot be broken down into anything smaller and still retain the properties of that element. There are 92 naturally occurring elements. There are many other synthetic elements that humans have created, but those are typically unstable and short-lived. Living organisms are comprised almost entirely of only 4 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Right? Greater than 95% of our mass is just those 4 elements. And there are many other elements that are needed to maintain life. And these are typically required in very minute amounts, so they're trace elements. So here we see some examples, right? The big 4, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. We have many other elements we need: calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, and then some other things that occur in very, very minute amounts, just trace elements. So normally these are all found in abundance in the foods we eat. Now, if there is a deficiency in one or more of the elements, you can often see that. So here we're looking at plants. These short corn stalks are stunted. Their growth is stunted because of a nitrogen deficiency, right? Because plants need nitrogen to grow. If you grow them in soils that are very poor in nitrogen, you need to fertilize. Otherwise, the plants grow very, very poorly. Here we see an example of a nutrient deficiency in humans. And this is a goiter. A goiter is an enlarged thyroid gland. And your thyroid needs iodine in order to function properly. So iodine deficiency causes the thyroid to grow, to enlarge, to try and compensate, for the lack of iodine. So it's a goiter. If you catch a goiter early, it's treatable just by eating foods with iodine. Most of the salt that's sold here in the US and many developed countries is iodized salt. So iodine is put specifically in the salt to make sure that we all get enough iodine in our diet. So when it comes to atoms, we know that atoms are made of 3 subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge, and neutrons are neutral. They have no charge. So the nucleus of an atom contains the protons and neutrons, and then circling that nucleus are the electrons. Now, electrons are particles. They do have mass, right? They do move. But we typically think of them in regions of space around the nucleus called clouds. So a cloud of negativity or negative charge rather than actual discrete particle. We tend to think of clouds because the electrons, all the cartoons you normally see with the electrons circling an atom, they're just that. They're just a cartoon. That's not how they actually work. So different atoms have different numbers of subatomic particles. An element's atomic number is the number of protons in its nucleus. So hydrogen has an atomic number of 1 because it only has 1 proton. And we often just call a hydrogen atom or ion a proton because that's all it is basically. A carbon has a number of 6 because it has 6 protons. Oxygen has an atomic number of 8 because it has 8 protons. The mass number is the sum of protons plus neutrons. So it's very easy to determine how many neutrons are by knowing the mass number and the atomic number, right? So hydrogen, we said it just has a proton, so has a mass number of 1. Carbon has a mass number of 12, but the atomic number for carbon is 6. So we know carbon has 6 protons. The mass number is 12, which means it has 6 neutrons, right? 6 plus 6 is 12. For oxygen, the mass number is 16, but we know the atomic number is 8. So oxygen has 8 protons. A mass number of 16 means it also has 8 neutrons, right? So the atomic number is the number of protons, and the mass number is protons plus neutrons. Now the actual atomic mass is slightly different than the mass number, but it's almost exactly the same, but it's slightly different. And that's because a particular element can have different isotopes. An isotope has a different number of neutrons. And so that changes the weight, right, the mass of that particular atom. And so technically the atomic mass is the average of all of the isotopes. But as we'll see, the atomic mass is almost exactly the same as the mass number. On a periodic table, you have different representations of the symbols. Like here we have helium. In this case, the number on top is the mass, with the number of protons plus neutrons. On the bottom is the atomic number, which is just the number of protons. Sometimes they switch it. Here we see an atomic number where the proton number of 2 is on top, and on the bottom is the atomic mass, 4.003, right? The mass number was 4, right? Which is almost exactly the same as 4.003, but this is the average of all the isotopes, right? But most people will say, you know, the actual mass and mass number is basically the same thing because they're only very slightly different. But notice that they can be reversed, right, as to which one's on top and which is on the bottom. Not only that, but in some cases here, what they're calling the atomic mass is really the mass number, not the actual mass. The actual mass is 4.003. But here they're just calling it the atomic mass, right? So, and that's because, you know, the mass number and the actual mass are almost identical, right? There's only a very slight difference. But it's important to understand what the symbols are and what the numbers mean on the symbols. So for carbon, you know, carbon 12, this is the mass number of protons plus neutrons, and then the atomic number is just the number of protons. So if I were to ask you, how many neutrons does carbon have? 12 minus 6 equals 6, right? Or 6 plus 6 equals 12. So you know, right, from the mass number and the atomic number, what the number of protons are. You also know what the number of electrons are, right? Because electrons are negatively charged, and protons are positively charged, those charges have to be balanced. They have to be equal, right? So if you know the number of protons, it's the same number of electrons. Any questions on that? All atoms of an element have the same number of protons, but they may have different numbers of neutrons, and we call those isotopes. So isotopes are two atoms of an element, well, two or more atoms of an element that differ in the number of neutrons. So carbon 14, right, the normal carbon is carbon 12, but carbon 14 is an isotope of carbon. It has the same number of protons, 6, right, same as regular carbon, but it's got 8 neutrons, which is why it's carbon 14 and not carbon 12. When it comes to hydrogen, hydrogen normally is just a proton, right? No neutrons, just a proton, and there's an electron that circles around it, right? And so that's our typical hydrogen. The technical name is protium, right? So protium is just a hydrogen atom. If the hydrogen has a neutron, it's now called deuterium. If a hydrogen has 2 neutrons, it's called tritium. So one of the things about isotopes is sometimes they are radioactive, which means they decay, they break down, and they release radiation. A deuterium is not radioactive, but tritium is. Now deuterium, if you use 2 deuterium hydrogens and an oxygen, H2O, you get water. And we call that heavy water, right? So deuterium water is heavy water. It's not radioactive. It is used in some nuclear reactors, but not because it's radioactive. And in fact, I just looked up a statistic that says that we all have some deuterium water, some heavy water in our bodies, maybe as much as 5 grams of heavy water. And that's okay, that's normal. It's not going to hurt you. If you had an excessive amount of deuterium water, heavy water, in your body, then you would die, because heavy water doesn't work the exact same way as regular water does. So having too much of it's going to screw up a lot of your biochemical reactions inside of a cell, and that will kill you. And then, of course, tritium is radioactive, so you would, suffer the consequences of that radioactivity. But isotopes do tend to be unstable, right? They break down and they release particles and radiation. So a radioactive isotope will spontaneously decay. When that happens, it gives off particles and energy. Alpha particles are basically just a helium nucleus. No electrons, just a helium nucleus. And alpha particles are not dangerous, right? They will not penetrate your skin. Toilet paper can block them, right? So they're not dangerous. Beta particles are high energy electrons, so they're slightly more dangerous. Although they really can't penetrate your skin, if you were to ingest something or drink something which is radioactive and releasing beta radiation, that would be dangerous. And then gamma rays are very high energy forms of electromagnetic radiation. They are the most dangerous types of radiation. They penetrate right through you, and they do a lot of damage along the way as they're moving through you. They damage DNA, RNA, enzymes, they cause free radicals to form. Excess gamma rays will kill you. Right, so very, very dangerous types of radiation. But when a radioactive isotope, when it decays, it releases the radiation and it forms a new element. So radioactive decay will form new elements. So something like radium, right? Very radioactive. When it decays, it produces radon and a helium, an alpha particle, right? So the radium has become radon, which is still radioactive. Radon will further decay into polonium, and then lead, and then bismuth. So as these radioactive elements decay, they form other elements, ultimately reaching a stable form. But in the process of decay, they're releasing radiation. So you probably have all heard of the term half-life, right? The radioactive half-life. It's the time it takes for half of the radiation to be released and to dissipate. So when it comes to the half-life of radioactive compounds, if you had to live next to a radioactive area, would you want to live next to a radioactive area that has elements with a short half-life or a long half-life? What would you rather live next to? I mean, obviously, no one wants to live next to a radioactive site, but if you had to live next to one, do you want to live next to one that has radioactive elements with short half-lives or long half-lives? Okay, Chris says short. Anybody else? You guys agree? You want to live next to something with a short half-life or a long half-life in terms of radioactivity? Lauren says long. Anybody else have an opinion? Nobody wants to say?
What's the difference again?
A short half-life means that the radioactive element decays very quickly, right? So it's trying to reach that inert stage, right? That stable stage. So it doesn't last as long. A long half-life means that it takes a whole lot longer for that element to decay and form that stable form. So the question is, do you want to live next to long half-life or short half-life?
Short.
So most people are saying short. Lauren said long, maybe someone else said long. So actually Lauren is correct. And the reason why is a radioactive element with a short half-life is decaying very quickly, which means it's releasing a lot of radiation very quickly. That's very dangerous. A radioactive element with a long half-life is releasing radiation very slowly over a longer period of time. So your exposure is less intense. And that's actually better. So something with a very long half-life, and let's say it's got a half-life of 1,000 years. I want to be next to that compared to something with a half-life of 1 year, right? Because a 1 year half-life means it's producing a lot more radiation, and that's a lot more dangerous. So longer half-life is safer in the long run than a shorter half-life is, if you had to live next to something radioactive. So when it comes to electrons and their energy levels, and I already wrote on this, but the idea is that electrons, they do have energy, right? They are high energy particles. And so there are different regions around an atom where you find the electrons. And the higher the region, right, the further away from the atomic nucleus the electrons are, the higher the energy they have. And so what this was illustrating here is that as the electrons go from one energy level to another, they decrease in energy. And as an electron moves from one, what they call shell, one energy level down to the next, some energy gets released. And cells can actually harness that energy and use it to do work, right? Because we learned that energy is needed to do work. And when it comes to aerobic cell respiration, we're going to see that it's all about the electrons and how important the electrons are. But the energy has to get released in little steps. So here, if you had the electron and then you release that energy all at once, right, that's a massive release of energy. But if the electron falls down to the next step, the next energy level, then there's less energy that's released. And then on down and so on and so forth. So here, a lot of energy would be released all at once. If that happens, it would be dangerous. It could potentially be an explosive release of energy. And so when it comes to cells, we have to release that energy in little bitty steps, right? So that not too much energy gets released all at once, because that would be dangerous and deadly. So imagine, hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is explosive. Helium, right, the next element up, is not explosive, right? So hydrogen with its one proton, one electron is explosive. Helium is not, because it has two electrons and it's happy. It's not reactive. But the hydrogen is. So imagine if you were in a room that was filling with hydrogen gas and you lit a match, it would explode, right? But if you lit the match and burned off the hydrogen a little bit at a time, then no explosion. And so cells need to harness the energy as electrons are released from one energy level to the next, as they step down from one energy level to the next. And that's very important when it comes to aerobic cell respiration, as we'll learn about later. But there are different energy levels, and they're called shells surrounding the nucleus of an atom, and this is where you find the electrons. So electrons circle the atomic nucleus, right? Remember, the nucleus is protons plus neutrons in regions called orbitals. An orbital is a region of space around the nucleus where the probability of finding an electron is high. No more than 2 electrons can occupy any given orbital. Orbitals are arranged in shells around the atomic nucleus. So there are different shells at different energy levels. Each shell contains orbitals. Orbitals is where you find the electrons, but no more than 2 electrons in any given orbital. If there's more than one orbital in a shell, the orbitals are divided within subshells. So this gets, rather complicated, as we'll see. Each successive shell has a higher energy level than the previous shell. So as you move outward away from the nucleus of an atom, those electrons have more and more energy. An electron vacancy in the outermost shell, which is called the valence shell, means that an atom may lose, gain, or share electrons to form a chemical bond. So the outermost shell is the valence shell. Whether an atom has 2 shells, 4 shells, 8 shells, right, the outermost one is the valence shell, right? Whatever the outermost one is, that is the valence shell. And we call those electrons in the valence shell valence electrons. Electrons like to be in pairs. Electrons do not like to be alone. Okay, if they are alone, then they can form a chemical bond, right, by exchanging or sharing electrons. So this is what does get complicated. We're not going to worry about all the details. If and when you take chemistry, you're going to do a lot with this stuff. But we have shells and orbitals. So our first orbital which is in the first shell, is the s orbital. Remember that an orbital can hold no more than 2 electrons. So here we're looking at the element neon, right? So neon has 2 shells, right? In the first shell, you have the 1s orbital. 1 because it's the first shell, and s because it's the first of the orbitals is s. It can only hold 2 electrons, which is why you see just 2 electrons here, right? Our next shell actually has 8 electrons in it. And notice they're all paired together, right? So in this case, the valence shell is full of electrons. It has 8 of them. And this is a happy atom, right? So neon is very happy. It's got 8 in its outermost shell. We're going to talk about 8 later on. But in the second shell, we again have another s orbital. It's the 2s because it's in the second shell. It holds 2 electrons. And then we have 3 p orbitals. And because they're in the second shell, they're called 2p. But they're p orbitals. So we have s orbitals, we have p orbitals. If we had another shell, we'd have some d orbitals and up to f orbitals. So f is the highest. And that's because an atom, if it were to have that many shells, right, to have that many orbitals, it would be a huge atom, very unstable. It would not last long at all. It would break down, decay very quickly. So F is the highest. So the s orbital holds 2 electrons. There are 3 p orbitals. Each orbital can only hold 2 electrons. So 3 p's, 3 times 2 is 6, right? So you can have 6 electrons in your p orbitals. When it comes to d orbitals, a total of 10, so that means 5 d orbitals. And f, we have 14 electrons, so that means there's 7 f orbitals, but we're not going to worry about d and f. But this is how that works. Each orbital can only hold 2 electrons, no more. So the p orbitals, you can think of a figure 8 shape, right? So like here is one of them, and then the other one, goes this way, and then the other one goes that way. But they're kind of, figure 8 shaped, or the infinity symbol. But imagine that in 3 dimensions. So, but those are the regions where you find those electrons. When it comes to the d and f orbitals, their shapes get kind of funky and weird. We're not going to worry about that. But the point is that atoms have shells, and you find the electrons in the shells. Within the shells, you have orbitals. There are s orbitals and p orbitals, d and f orbitals. Each orbital can hold no more than 2 electrons. So no more than 2. If the outermost shell is full of electrons, they're all paired together, as I said, that's a happy atom. That's a happy element. It's not going to be reactive because all the electrons are already paired together. So it's going to be inert. And neon gas is inert. It's not reactive. It doesn't react with anything, right? Because it's a happy atom. It's got 8 electrons in its outermost shell and the valence shell, and they're all paired together. So it's happy. But the key point here is that there are orbitals where you find the electrons, no more than 2 electrons in any given orbital. So here we see just a small version of the periodic table to make some observations. So first question, how can you tell how many electrons an atom has? I already answered that question. So how do you know how many electrons an atom has?
Electrons equal the same number of protons.
right? And so how do you know the number of protons?
The number of protons is the atomic number.
Right? Yep, the atomic number. So you can always tell the number of electrons because it equals the atomic number, which is the number of protons, right? So if we look at elements with atomic numbers 6 and 14, so what do they have in common? So let's go back. 6 and 14. So 6 is carbon, 14 is silicon. So what do these two elements have in common? Well, they don't have the same number of protons, right? 6 and 14. They don't have the same number of neutrons, right? Lauren says they have the same number of valence electrons, right? So look at the outermost shell. A carbon just has 2, silicon has 3, but notice there are 4 electrons in the outermost shell for carbon and 4 in the outermost shell of silicon. Notice they are not paired together. Even though there are 4 electrons, they are in different orbitals, right? So they're not in the same orbital, which means they're not paired together. So the answer would be they have the same valence, right? The outermost electrons, which was 4. 4 for silicon and 4 for carbon. Once again, notice they are not paired together, which means they're in different orbitals. How many chemical bonds are possible for beryllium and magnesium? So we find beryllium here, magnesium here. So how many possible chemical bonds can both of these make, or each one makes? They're going to be the same. So how many chemical bonds, right, can beryllium make and magnesium make? Two, right? Because electrons don't like to be alone. So an electron that's alone is more likely to form a chemical bond with another atom or another element. And so we again see that these two electrons are in different orbitals, are not paired together. And so that means they can form 2 bonds. When we look at carbon and silicon, how many bonds can they form? 4, right? Because they have 4 unpaired electrons, because all 4 electrons are in different orbitals, right? So they're not paired together. Electrons don't like to be alone, right? They want to be paired up. And if you have to share electrons to get the pair, that's how a chemical bond forms. So incomplete valence shells allow for chemical bonds to form, right? Because the electrons want to be in pairs. If you have unpaired electrons, then a chemical bond can form, so electrons can be shared, so they can be paired up. So a sharing of electrons between 2 or more atoms or ions is a chemical bond. If we combine 2 or more atoms together, that's called a molecule. A compound is a molecule of 2 or more atoms bonded together that never changes its proportions. So like water is always H2O. Sucrose always has its same chemical formula. It doesn't change, right? An amino acid, it's the same structure always. A mixture is 2 or more elements or molecules or compounds that intermingle in varying proportions. So like sucrose and water, you can make a 1% sucrose solution, a 2%, a 10%, a 20%. That is a mixture, right? Because the proportions vary. You know, the ocean, it's mostly sodium and chloride, but there's a lot of other stuff in there. It's not the exact same concentration everywhere, and there's a lot of pollutants in the water too. Same thing with the atmosphere. The concentration of oxygen is not the same in all levels of the atmosphere, and there are different pollutants, right, in different locations. So it's a mixture of things. So the types of bonds that can form involving electrons are ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. A covalent bond is where two atoms with unpaired electrons will attract each other. And remember, those unpaired electrons are in the outermost shell, the valence shell. So by sharing your unpaired electrons, you create a pair. So atoms that share two or more pairs of electrons form covalent bonds. And this is the strongest of these three types of bonds. Ionic and hydrogen bonds are nowhere near as strong as a covalent bond is. And there can be a single covalent bond where one pair of electrons is shared, a double covalent bond where two pairs of electrons are shared, or 4 electrons total, and even triple covalent bonds where 3 pairs of electrons or 6 electrons are shared, right, between two atoms. So here we see hydrogen. Hydrogen just has 1 electron in its outermost shell. So hydrogens easily bond to each other to form H2, right, a hydrogen molecule. And we use a line just to indicate a covalent bond. With oxygen, let's go back to our little table here. So oxygen has how many unpaired electrons in its outermost shell?
2.
2, which means oxygen can form 2 bonds, right? So oxygen can bond with itself, right, with another oxygen, and form a double covalent bond. So they're sharing 2 pairs of electrons, or 4. When it comes to water, we have oxygen, which again has those 2 unpaired electrons. Hydrogen, we know, has an unpaired electron, so oxygen can bond with 2 hydrogens to make H2O, or water. And then methane is CH4. We know that carbon had 4 unpaired electrons in its outermost shell, and it can form 4 bonds. So it can bond to 4 hydrogens to make methane gas. Now, when you look at the oxygen and the carbon, what we notice is, and when we were looking at the neon before, 8 electrons is the magic number. We call that the octet rule. So with the exception of hydrogen and helium, right, the little ones, atoms that have 8 electrons in their outermost shell are stable. They're happy. So something like neon, you know, argon, krypton, xenon, the noble gases, all have 8 electrons in their outermost shell. So that's why they are inert and non-reactive, because they already have 8 and they're happy. But everything else has some unpaired electrons, which means that they will react with other atoms in order to form chemical bonds, right, these covalent bonds, or an ionic bond, as a way to achieve the 8 electrons in the outermost shell. So even if they're sharing electrons, if they're sharing, you know, 1 electron or more than 1 electron, they still sort of have 8 electrons in their outermost shell. Even though they're sharing them with another atom, right, it's better to share, right, than to not have them at all. Right, so as your mother told you, sharing is caring, right? So it's better to share those electrons than not to have them at all. And by sharing them, they form a chemical bond. But 8 is the magic number, for almost everything, except the little ones, like a hydrogen. Now, when it comes to sharing those electrons, atoms don't always share them equally. If they do share them equally, like the 2 hydrogens sharing an electron, or the 2 oxygens bonded to each other, if the 2 atoms are sharing the electrons equally, we say that covalent bond is nonpolar. So a nonpolar covalent bond means that the electrons are being shared equally. But not all atoms like to share equally. In that case, that covalent bond is called a polar covalent bond. Whenever you have a polar covalent bond, that produces some slight charges on those atoms, slight positive and slight negative charges. So the best example is water, H2O. Oxygen is big. Hydrogens are small. So even though they have bonded to each other and they're sharing electrons, the oxygen is much bigger and stronger. It pulls those shared electrons closer to it, right? So closer to the oxygen. So it's pulling those negatively charged electrons closer towards it. So the oxygen develops a partial negative charge, not a full negative. It's not an ion, but it's a partial negative charge. And since the hydrogens are not able to keep those electrons as close, right, the negativity is further away from them, and the hydrogens develop a slight positive charge. So a water molecule is a polar molecule because it has polar covalent bonds. And as we'll learn next lecture, that's what makes water very special, is the fact that it has these polar covalent bonds and these partial charges on the oxygens and the hydrogens. Now, electronegativity is the tendency of an atom to attract electrons towards itself. So it's more electronegative, it's going to pull those electrons closer towards it. If you have a significant difference in electronegativities of 2 atoms sharing electrons, you get a polar covalent bond. If it's a huge difference, you'll get an ionic bond. So an ion is an atom that loses or gains an electron. If it loses an electron, it's losing negativity, which means it has a net positive charge. If an atom gains an electron, it's gaining negativity, so it has a negative charge. Opposites attract, right? So an ionic bond involves positively charged atoms and negatively charged atoms that are attracted to each other. So that's an ionic bond. It's not a very strong bond, but that's an ionic bond. So here we see sodium, like that highly reactive metal. It's highly reactive because it has an unpaired electron in its outermost shell. And that's why when you put some sodium metal in water, it reacts so strongly it explodes. Chlorine is also has an unpaired electron in its outermost shell, but it has 7 electrons in the outermost shell. Sodium just has that 1 electron all by itself in the outermost shell. And so sodium readily donates that electron, because once sodium loses that electron, the next shell is full. It's got 8, right? The octet rule, it's happy, it's stable. So that's why sodium metal is so reactive. It wants to give up that electron, to virtually anything in order to become stable. And then chlorine will happily accept that electron so that it has 8 electrons in its outermost shell. But it becomes negatively charged, and the sodium is now positively charged. And so they attract each other. So we call this an ionic bond. And I have a little video to show you. So let me share my screen.
Ionic bonding occurs between two atoms when one of the atoms has sufficient strength of attraction to remove an electron from the other atom. A sodium atom has one valence electron, with a stable energy level below containing 8 electrons. A chlorine atom has 7 valence electrons. If the atoms collide with sufficient energy, the chlorine atom will remove the electron from the sodium. The sodium atom loses its only valence electron and becomes a positively charged sodium ion. The energy level below now provides sodium with its stable octet. The extra electron completes a stable octet for chlorine, which becomes a negatively charged chloride ion. Covalent bonding occurs when neither atom has sufficient strength to completely remove the other atom's electrons. The atoms share electrons, and both atoms achieve a stable outer energy level. A hydrogen atom with one valence electron needs one additional electron to complete the first energy level. An oxygen atom has 6 valence electrons and needs 2 additional electrons to complete the second energy level. As the oxygen and hydrogen atoms collide, covalent bonding is accomplished by the sharing of electrons. By sharing an electron pair with the oxygen, the hydrogen completes the noble gas configuration of helium. By sharing with the hydrogen atom, the oxygen atom now has 7 electrons in its energy level, still one short of the stable octet condition. A stable octet for oxygen can be completed by sharing an electron with another hydrogen atom.
Any questions about that?
Do you remember that Ruben guy?
Ruben. No, which one's he?
He, I don't know, he's like sort of...
Now I have to get back to where we were. So, this question here asks, what kind of bond do you think will form if you combine these two elements together? An ionic bond, a polar covalent bond, or a non-polar covalent bond? Now, we already did A, right? We know that sodium and chlorine make an ionic bond. What do you think about lithium and fluorine? Ionic, right? Because lithium is in the same column as sodium, and fluorine in the same column as chlorine. So we can logically guess that lithium and fluorine will also form an ionic bond. What about carbon and oxygen? Right? Here's carbon, here's oxygen. Oxygen's bigger than carbon, right? Not a lot bigger, but it's bigger than carbon. So most likely it will be a covalent bond, but is it polar or non-polar? So what do you think, polar or non-polar? Okay, Chris says non-polar. Everybody agree? Anybody disagree? Well, we'll find out shortly. What about nitrogen and oxygen? They're much closer together, right? So not much difference between them. So you'd probably guess what? Non-polar covalent bond, right? What about silicon and chlorine? So here's silicon and then chlorine, right? They're kind of far apart. So what kind of bond do you think they'll form? Nobody wants to guess that one? Okay, Damiola says ionic, right? So one of the, now we're going to see in a second, and then F is easy, right? Right, hydrogen and hydrogen, right, can only make a nonpolar covalent bond, right, because they're exactly the same. Now, unless they're exactly the same atoms or maybe side by side on the periodic table, you can only really guess what kind of bond they'll make. In order to determine, right, to figure out the kind of bond that they make, you really need to know the electronegativities of each atom involved. And when you take chemistry, you'll actually do this, but we're going to look at a chemical bond polarity calculator. So I'm going to share my screen for this too. So here's our calculator. So one combination of the lithium and fluorine. So lithium and fluorine. Ionic bond, which is what we guessed based on sodium and chlorine, right? Carbon and oxygen. Is polar covalent, right? So they're just different enough that they're not going to be able to share those electrons equally. So it's not going to be a really strong polar covalent bond, but it is going to be a polar bond. Our next combination was nitrogen and oxygen, which were side by side on the periodic table. So let's see if they're similar enough or different enough. Non-polar covalent. So they are close enough on the periodic table, almost exactly the same electronegativity, that they're going to share those electrons equally. And the last combination was silicon and chlorine. Polar covalent. So they're far away from each other, but not so far to be able to form an ionic bond. So it'll be a very polar covalent bond, but they still will be sharing those electrons, just not equally. But the point is that you really do need to know what the electronegativities are to actually, determine what type of chemical bond will form, unless the atoms are the same or they're right next to each other. And I gotta work my way back to where we were. So hydrogen bonds are a weak type of bond, but as we'll see, there is strength in numbers. But this occurs when you have a polar covalent bond. And so the atoms involved develop those partial negative and positive charges. Most often we talk about hydrogen bonds between hydrogens and nitrogens and hydrogens and oxygens, right? A good example is a DNA molecule. When we learn about DNA, we'll learn that there are two strands of DNA that are held together to make that one DNA molecule. And those two strands are held together by hydrogen bonds, which are weak, but they're strong enough that there's enough of them to keep those two strands together. But they're not so strong that the strands cannot be pulled apart, because the cell has to pull the DNA strands apart in order to replicate DNA or to transcribe it to make RNA, which we'll learn about later on. So here we can see a slightly positive hydrogen is attracted to that slightly positive nitrogen, in this case an ammonia molecule, but it can also be another water molecule as well. And when we learn about water tomorrow, we're going to learn that water has its special properties because of hydrogen bonding. So weak bonds, interactions between slightly charged atoms, not fully charged, that would be ionic, so this is slightly charged, and those are hydrogen bonds. There are other kinds of bonds, like van der Waals forces, but the point to chemical bonds is that they do allow molecules to interact with each other, and they do give molecules their shapes. The strongest bonds are the covalent bonds, but ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, they are very important when it comes to the shape of molecules and the interactions between molecules. Van der Waals interactions or forces are very weak forces, right, between atoms that have slightly different charges. Now, a molecule can be, large enough that it has different parts of the molecule which have charges. So even if you have a neutral molecule, one end of the molecule could be positively charged and the other end actually negatively charged. Overall, that molecule is neutral, but it does have charges associated with it, which cause that molecule to interact with other molecules in very specific ways. So just a couple questions. So water is polar because of the presence of what kinds of bonds? What kinds of bonds make a water molecule polar? Polar covalent bonds, right? So when it comes to molecular shape and function, it all has to do with all the different kinds of bonds. So all of them, covalent, ionic, hydrogen, van der Waals, they all affect the shape of a molecule, and the shape also has to do with its function. And so it's all about chemical bonding. So shape and function have to do with all the chemical bonds, right? Polar covalent, nonpolar covalent, ionic, hydrogens, van der Waals forces, they're all involved. They're all very important. When it comes to receptors, the reasons why certain molecules can bind to receptors is because of the chemical bonds, right, that they form. Here we're looking at an endorphin receptor. So your natural endorphins are natural chemicals produced in the brain that make you feel good, that help to alleviate pain. A good example is the runner's high. If you go jogging over long distances, you're really struggling, it's really hard, it's starting to hurt, and then suddenly you feel so much better because your brain starts to release these natural endorphins, which bind to this receptor and give you a natural high. There are other chemicals which can bind to the endorphin receptor, which give you an artificial high, like morphine or heroin, right? Those kinds of things. They bind to these receptors as well, but they tend to bind a lot more strongly. But it all has to do with the interactions of the different atoms. So molecular shape and function go hand in hand with chemical bonding. Something to remember, right? All has to do with the chemical bonds. Now, a chemical reaction involves either making bonds or breaking bonds. So the molecules involved in the reaction are called the reactants, and they will react to form products. So new bonds can be formed, right, to form the product, or existing bonds can be broken in order to form the products, right? So you may combine two things together to make one larger molecule, or a larger molecule may be split into two smaller molecules. So bonds are formed and broken during chemical reactions, and that involves electrons either being shared or being split apart. So here we have some structures. So explain why each chemical structure is or is not correct. So let's look at A. So based on everything we've talked about, does this structure look like a good structure? Is everything right? Would you say that A is good or not?
No.
No. Any idea why?
Yeah, so there's still an extra valence electron in carbon.
Right. The problem here, remember, carbon makes 4 bonds. It's only showing 3, so that's no good, right? What about B?
I would say no because the central hydrogen atom can't have 2 bonds.
We're looking at B. At B.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your answer for C is going to be correct, but for B, what about B? Any problems you can see with B? No, B's good. C, as we heard, that's a problem. Hydrogen doesn't make 2 bonds, only makes 1, right? So that's no good, right? And then D, is D a good one? Right, that's no good, right? You can't have a double bond between hydrogen, right? And then oxygen has too many leftover electrons that are not bonded to anything, right? So that's no good either. Right, so B is the only good one, right? Because they all have problems, and that's shown here in the last slide. So any questions about, chemistry, the stuff that we talked about? Valence electrons, the octet rule, right? Sharing electrons to achieve the octet rule, right? To become stable and happy. We didn't mention it, but what do we call a positively charged ion? What's the word for that, for those of you that have taken chemistry? A cation. And what do we call a negatively charged ion? I'll give you a hint, it ends with the word ion.
Is it anion?
Yep, an anion, right? So, any questions on the chemistry that we did? Like I said, tomorrow we're going to learn more about the chemistry of water, specifically, and what makes water so special and so important for life.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
The dots in the structure represent the covalent bond, or do it represent the number of electrons?
Well, here they're actually showing the number of electrons, but where you see a pair of electrons or more than one pair being shared, between the atoms, that indicates a covalent bond. So here in B, for example, the hydrogen and oxygen share a covalent bond, and the oxygen and carbon share a covalent bond, right? A covalent bond between the hydrogens and carbon, and carbons or hydrogen. And then here between this carbon and oxygen, they're actually sharing two covalent bonds. So this is a double bond here, right? Because there are 4 electrons involved, 2 pairs. They just wanted to show you the actual numbers of electrons and where they are. You could also just draw the straight lines. You'd have 2 double lines, or a double line here between carbon and oxygen, and then single lines between everything else. But they just wanted to emphasize the actual numbers of electrons involved. Anything else?